Hello, my name is Tony Miano. I'm a member of Grace Fellowship Church in Davenport, Iowa, and I serve my church as an evangelist, which means I have been vetted, called, and sent by the pastors of my local assembly to do the work of evangelism on the streets of our community and beyond. In addition to that, as my pastors see fit and as the opportunity arises, I will also assist other like-minded churches in their own evangelism efforts and in training up men within those congregations to do the work of evangelism under the authority of their pastors. For the last 12 years, an aspect of my ministry has been what I call crosswalking. I have about a 5.5-foot tall cross that says "Stop and Talk" on the crossbeam, and I will stand on various corners throughout my community, hoping for people to stop and talk. And the Lord has been very gracious to me in that effort, and that hundreds of people over the years have stopped to engage in conversation with many, if not close to all of them, hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was thinking about writing a book about crosswalking, and I've gotten pretty far into that work, but realizing that those Christians who are engaged in one form or another of biblical evangelism is a relatively small niche within the greater evangelical community. And realizing on top of that those who either already engage in crosswalking or might have a thought or desire to do that is a very small segment of that very tiny niche of Christians within evangelicalism. And so I thought, instead of writing a book, maybe I should do a series of what I'll call instructional videos on the nuts and bolts of crosswalking. And this will be the first one in that series, an introduction to that. And I think I'll begin by simply telling the story of how I got started crosswalking. Again, it was 12 years ago, July of 2009, when I first carried a cross on the street corner in my community. And how that came about was I saw an article in our local newspaper about a man named Willie Young, not a name any of you would know. Willie was a man in my community who for years stood on various street corners with very large signs that called people to believe in Jesus. I remember seeing Willie on the streets when I was working patrol as a deputy sheriff in my community, and seeing him about town as I'm driving around town running errands and what have you. And I always thought it was odd. I always thought that's not a really effective way to do ministry, and wondered if Willie was all there, quite frankly. But I read this article in our local paper, and it was very well written. It was even-handed. It was balanced. They didn't paint Willie as a crazy person or a zealot or a fanatic, but simply a man in the community who wanted to try to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I read that article, and I was convicted for thinking negatively about that kind of ministry, thinking negatively about Willie, having never actually stopped to talk to him. And I also had what I would call a strange conviction going on inside me that maybe I ought to do something like that. And I can assure you I did not want to do anything like that. By then I was open air preaching. I had been open air preaching by then for five years or so, distributing gospel tracts, engaging people in conversation. By 2009 I was serving with Living Waters, Ray Comfort's ministry, where I had put together and led an aspect of that ministry called the Ambassadors Academy. And so my life was already well committed to the public proclamation of the gospel. But something inside me said, you ought to do this too. So I was sitting in my office. I had a small office at the time. And on the wall in my office was a cross, maybe about 4 feet tall. And it was hanging on the wall. It was a large, relatively large wooden cross that a young man had built to put on the wall of the meeting room at our community's homeowners association clubhouse, where we held church services during the time when I was pastoring a church plant. Well, after the doors of that church plant closed, I kept that beautiful cross. I maintained the office and I hung it on the wall. And one day I'm sitting in my office for whatever reason, and I couldn't stop looking at that cross. And I couldn't stop thinking about Willie Young. And I couldn't stop thinking about this nagging idea that maybe I should be on the street with signs. Maybe that would be another way of creating opportunity to communicate the gospel to people. And everything in me was saying, don't do it. Don't do it. People will think you're crazy. The deputies that you used to work with, when they drive by, they'll be shaking their head, wondering, well, is that Tony? What happened to Tony? But I could not shake this sense that I should do something with that cross. I talked to Maria about it. Her eyes kind of got big too, like, uh-oh. What is he going to do? And as we talked about it, I told her, I said, I think I ought to put something on the crossbeam of that cross and stand on corners and hope that people will stop to talk to me. And so with that first cross, what I put on the crossbeam with some 4-inch tall bright white decals was, "Are you ready?" There wasn't even enough room for a question mark at the end of that. Just 3 words, "Are you ready?" And I remember that afternoon, after putting those stickers on, those decals on, I went to a corner on Lyons Avenue in Santa Clarita, California. And there I stood with the cross. Part of me hoping that someone would stop to talk, to validate this crazy idea, and part of me hoping no one would. So I could say, well, that didn't work, and move on to something else. But as I stood there, the first thing I noticed was that as people stopped at the light and would look over and see me standing there with that cross that said, "Are you ready?" many of them would buckle their seatbelts. And at first I thought, well, that's just coincidence. I'm just wanting to see something. I'm making something out of nothing. But it kept happening over and over and over again. And I thought, wow, maybe standing here with this cross is at least getting people to think. And I was only out there for a short time, but while I was out there, a man stopped to talk to me. And he asked the question I would be asked dozens, if not hundreds of times while I carried that first cross. Ready for what? It says, "Are you ready?" Am I ready for what? Well, are you ready to stand before God and give an account for your life? Are you ready for eternity? And that's how many conversations started, as it did that day with that man who stopped and he heard the gospel that day. And I remember in those early days, people stopping and saying, "I see you all over town. I keep seeing that cross and those words, 'Are you ready?' And I've got to ask you, ready for what?" Or people would stop and say, "I don't think I'm ready," knowing that since those words were on a cross, having some kind of religious background, knew what that question meant. And people would stop and admit, I'm not ready. What do I have to do to be ready? Well, over the years, as I continued doing that ministry, and I've now crosswalked in several different states. I've been on many college campuses and on too many street corners to count over the years. But as I've continued in this aspect of ministry, several years ago, I decided to try different sayings on the crossbeam. And the one I've used now 5 to 6 days a week for the last 5 years or so is stop and talk. And hundreds of people have done just that. In fact, just since the lockdowns began with this alleged pandemic, more than 200 people have stopped to engage in conversation. And one of the wonderful aspects of this kind of ministry is that in all the years I've been doing this, again, for 12 years now, in all the years that I've been doing this, and the hundreds, if not thousands of people who have stopped to either just get a gospel tract or a free Bible, or have stopped to have conversation, I can literally count on one hand the number of people who stopped to have an argument. By the time someone gets up the courage or the unction, by the time someone makes the determination to actually stop and talk to me, they want to have the conversation. And because I'm out there with a cross, and the vast majority of the people, certainly in the United States, if around the world, knowing what the cross represents, at least who it represents, Jesus, they stop knowing that they're going to engage in a spiritual conversation. And so oftentimes these days, I will begin the conversation after introductions with, do you have any particular spiritual beliefs? And that will take the conversation down the road leading to the gospel. I have had people of all walks of life, of just about every ethnic group, certainly in the communities where I'm in, various age groups, what have you, all kinds of different people stop to talk. I remember one young lady in the dead of winter. She stopped with tears in her eyes and asked, does my 7-year-old daughter have brain cancer because of my sin? One young man stopped at the urging of one of his friends. One of his friends said, "What? Have you ever seen that guy on the street with the cross? Why don't you stop and talk to him? Maybe he can help you." And what he needed help with was that he overheard a conversation about a murder that had taken place, and he wasn't sure what to do with that information. And so we had a good conversation about that, helped him, I think, to make the right decision as to what to do with that information. I would see him several days later. He would come back to let me know that he did the right thing. And then he said, now can you help me with my relationship with my girlfriend? One young lady was on her way home from work one morning, and she was driving home from a hospice care facility where she serves as a nurse. And as she's walking across the street toward me, I can already see the tears running down her cheeks. And just minutes before she saw me, or at least that morning, sometime before she saw me as she was driving home, her grandfather died in her facility, and she was broken. And so she stopped with tears, asking for prayer and a Bible, and we had a wonderful, wonderful gospel conversation. There have been people along the way who have made professions of faith in Christ on the street corners. There have been those who have visited my church as a result. And so the Lord, who of course receives all the credit, all the glory, all the praise for everything that happens in any aspect of my ministry, he has allowed some extraordinary things to happen on street corners throughout my community and elsewhere, simply because I stood there on a street corner holding a 5.5-foot tall cross that said "Stop and Talk," and waved at motorists as they drove by, and people stopped to talk. And certainly this is only one way of engaging in public evangelism. There are many, many others, and this might not be for you at all. That's okay. You don't have to be a crosswalker. You don't have to engage in crosswalking. But if the idea intrigues you, or if you've been thinking about it for some time and are just wondering how to get started, or if you're doing it and are just hoping for some more tips and maybe some encouragement, I'd ask you to stay tuned. I'd ask you to stay with me and watch these videos. And my hope is that they will be edifying to you, that they will be instructive to you, and that I will get to meet other people like myself who dare to stand on street corners with a cross, hoping that people will stop and talk. So that's an introduction. I hope, again, that even in this, that you've been encouraged. If you have questions about crosswalking, just leave them in the comments section below. That might help me to determine a segment, a video segment to do in this series on crosswalking. Or if you want to share a testimony, please do so in the comment section below. I would love to read that and maybe even share those in future videos. So today I am in Comanche, Iowa, about 35 miles northeast along the Mississippi River, from about 35 miles northeast of Davenport, where I live. There is a church up here that we are hoping to establish relationship with, our church and theirs, and to maybe help them with some of their evangelism efforts. And so I'm up here today to get a lay of the land. And having never been here before, I'm determining where would be the best spot in this town of a few thousand people to stand with the cross, to be seen by the largest number of motorists, and to give myself the best opportunity to have someone stop and talk to me. And so likely in the next video, or one of the videos here coming up, we will talk about picking a spot. Maybe the next one will be, where do I get a cross? How do I make a cross? What should I make a cross out of? And maybe we'll start there. But either way, welcome. Thanks for watching this video. And I hope you'll stay with me for this series on crosswalking.